Alright, what is up guys, it is Stormback here with another video, and in this one I am bringing you chapters 1 and 2 of The Spring of the Plague, a new Naruto story by Zenthis Oror. Now if you want to check this story out for yourself, the link to it will be down in the description below. But before the video begins, if you like the content you're seeing, be sure to subscribe, like, and comment. I mean, they're all free, so why not? If you want some dope channel merch, the links to that will be down in the description below. And if you want to see more of me, go check out my other channels and go follow me on Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok, which will all be linked down below. But, without further ado, why don't we just dive right on in. It was the spring after Orochimaru's death, when 3 Konoha ninja found the last of the secret laboratories. They found it at the base of an old umbrella pine. The entrance had been sealed with rocks and filled with pine needles, and it was almost lost in a thicket of red bracken. But almost was not good enough for 3 Konoha ninja, already excited by the prospect of returning home, and eager to finish their job. Are you sure this is it? Gobo brushed away the charred bracken from the rocks and thanked his lucky stars he was wearing gloves. The stones were hot from the fire jutsu Ninjin had used to clear the bracken. No doubt about it, Ninjin lifted a rock from the entrance and wrinkled her nose. Smell that? It smells like all the rest of them. Gobo sniffed attentively and immediately recoiled. The cold wisp of air floating up from the hole was sharp with ammonia and the bitter sweetness of chlorine. His nose stung, and as Daikon and Ninjin continued to shift rocks from the entrance, the smell grew, and grew more textured. There was an undertone of mildew, a top note of something fruity, and shot throughout something acrid and poisonous. "Here goes the fun part," said Daikon, his smile typically dry. He dropped the lantern down the entrance. It landed on the floor below with a clatter and fell on its side. They held their breath and waited, straining their eyes for signs of movement in the dark. Nothing, decided Gobo, after listening to his heart drum in his ears for 3 minutes. Nothing, agreed Ninjin, but be careful. They levered themselves down the entrance and Daikon picked up the lantern. They walked down the corridor of the complex in silence. It was small compared to other laboratories they had seen, which was a good sign. It meant there was not enough room to house large experimental subjects, at least not more than 1 or 2. Another team sent by Konoha to a cave in the west had found 30 or so subjects lying in their own blood, and not all of them had been dead. Gobo, Ninjin, and Daikon had been lucky so far. Ninjin opened the first door they came to with a gentle push of her fingertips. When nothing was triggered, they moved in. Gobo was mildly surprised. He had been expecting a surgical theater, a rack of sharp-toothed instruments on the walls, but this was more like an intensive care unit for a single patient. A bed took up the center, with the corners of its sheets turned down, and it was surrounded by screens and machines and a bunch of tubes. Gobo had done his stint as a practical medical ninja before switching to research. He recognized life support and dialysis machines when he saw them. "Daikon, you stay here and take stock of the equipment. Gobo, let's move on to the next room," Ninjin said briskly. She lit an old torch in the bracket before leaving. Apart from a bathroom, Gobo wondered how Orochimaru would manage the plumbing. There were 3 more rooms in the complex. One was a store cupboard which she left to Ninjin, because he couldn't stay there without his stomach heaving. There was a lab bench with a rack of staining chemicals, an incubator, and no doubt microscopes packed away in the cupboards. The last was a study. Gobo stopped there. He was here to collect up research papers that Orochimaru had written. As mad as the man was, he had been a genius scientist, and his research would be invaluable to Konoha medicine, if they could get a hold of it. Kusagekure had been making moves to demand papers as compensation for their genin, who had been killed in the Chunin exams. He was filling his bag with the contents of one of the filing cabinets, when Gobo heard a breaking of glass. It had come from the storeroom. "Ninjin," he cried, sliding into the doorway and covering his face with a mask against the smell. "What's happened?" "It's alright," Ninjin held up her hands. "I was just checking what was in this case and dropped one of the vials. No need to worry." Gobo shivered. The temperature in the store cupboard was well below any of the other rooms. Perhaps there was some sort of seal in action, withdrawing heat from the air. "This is Orochimaru's laboratory. Of course I'm worried." She scowled at him but bent down to the floor to pick through the glass. He crouched down beside her. There was a cap with a label, the stroke of the number already bleeding purple out of black. 1, he read. "They're numbered up to 10, Ninjin said, glancing through the case of vials again. She pulled out another one and peered into its cloudy contents. Stab vials. He's storing bacteria in them. "What kind?" asked Gobo. "You think my eyes are microscopes? How the hell would I know? Are you two ready to go? Called Daikon, bending his head around the doorway. Ninjin wiped her hand across her face and sneezed. Almost. She packed the rest of the vials into her bag. Gobo went back to the filing cabinet, trying to crush the feeling that something had just been done. That something had just been committed. And to convince himself that the chill running down his back was the air from the refrigerated storage room and not cold sweat. When the last of the folders and files were strapped to the sleigh, Ninjin, Daikon, and Gobo began their way back to Konoha. The entrance to the laboratory sealed once again, against rogue ninjas who might plunder it, and wild animals who might be tempted by the smell of decay. 10 days after their return, Gobo was in his hospital office. He was still trolling through Orochimaru and Kabuto's papers, sorting through for projects that were within the Konoha Ethical Code of Conduct to continue. There were, surprisingly, quite a few. Orochimaru and Kabuto both had their scientific training in Konoha, and their educational background was clear in the meticulous precision of their methods and their sourcing of resources. Orochimaru's papers said that his subjects were all either volunteers or death row prisoners, sold to him by the other nations in exchange for the results coming out of his laboratories. In that respect, Gobo was sad to admit, Konoha wasn't all that different. He adjusted the mask around his nose and mouth and coughed gently. It was early in the morning. There was nobody in the office yet, apart from himself. Truth be told, he wished he was still in bed. He had been feeling very out of sorts lately. Every so often he would break out into a fit of coughs, and in the past few days, those fits had become heavy and wet with mucus. His limbs felt heavy too, heavy and even a little painful. His joints ached when he did even the most basic exercises in their ninja fitness regimen, and he was finding it increasingly difficult to write. It wasn't his grip that was losing strength. His extremities were going numb. Sometimes he had to check to make sure his toes were still there. It was a terrible case of the flu, if ever there was one. He hid it well though, Gobo told himself, as he proceeded through the stack of papers. As a ninja, hiding pain was trained into them as a survival skill. The door opened behind him. Gobo, it was Daikon, pulling down his mask with a cough. He'd come down with a cold. His face was pale. I need to talk to you. What did Ninjin do in that storeroom at laboratory number 29? She broke a vial, didn't she? A twist of fear clenched Gobo's guts. What's happened to her? She started coughing up blood in her office. They've taken her to Ward 12. Ward 12 for unknown infectious diseases. A hurried, trembling voice informed Gobo, somewhere in the depths of his brain. Ward 12. Gobo's hands were trembling. He couldn't feel his fingers, so he set down his pen. I knew it, Gobo gasped, pulling off his glasses to rub his eyes. I knew this was going to come back and bite us in the ass. Somehow, Nervous laughter bubbled up from inside him, and Daikon reached across to put a hand on Gobo's shoulder. Hey, Gobo, calm down, man. The nervous laughter changed to a thick, hacking cough, and the next instant, Gobo was starkly aware of something wet and slippery lodged at the back of his throat. His mouth tasted salt, a mineral quality like iron or copper, and then his hands and the paper in front of him were dripping with blood. Daikon's hand flew off Gobo's shoulder. Gobo was dimly aware of Daikon locking the door of the office. There was a dull ringing in his ears, a pressure behind his eyes. He held his hand in front of him with his spoonful worth of blood cupped in their palms, and stared. Daikon was dialing a number on the internal communication systems. This is Office 306, he was saying into the device. One medic ninja showing the same symptoms as Nemoto Ninjin requests assistance to transport to Ward 12 with full hazard precautions. And Daikon coughed, loud and thick, and he paused, suddenly very silent. Make that 2 medic ninjas showing the same symptoms as Nemoto Ninjin. We are isolated together in Office 306. Thank you. He switched off the device and turned back to Gobo. There was blood running from the corner of Daikon's mouth, turned up in a painful, nervous smile. Help's on its way, he said. We should wash our hands. But 3 days later, Nemoto Ninjin, Hijiki Gobo, and Tsukimono Daikon were already dead, and their beds in Ward 12 were filled with another round of patients, checked in for a strange and unknown illness, spreading rapidly through Konoha. They called it the mottled cough and the snake death. It was the spring of Kimimaaru's plague. Sakura, are you awake? There was a knocking at her bedroom door. Sakura opened her eyes. The cool gray light of dawn was pushing through the curtains. On the bedside table, the alarm clock was lying on its face. She must have switched it off, but for the life of her, she couldn't remember when she had. "Sakura," called a voice outside her room again. The knocking grew more frantic until her mother flew open the bedroom door. "Sakura!" Her mother saw Sakura sitting up and rubbing her eyes, and stopped in the doorway. The color slowly returned to her white face. She breathed out slowly with her hand to her heart. "Please, Sakura," her mother said, smiling wearily. "Answer the door when I knock. I thought... Hearing the tremor in her mother's voice made Sakura want to curl up in bed again, but this time in shame. Her mother worried about her enough as it was. What with Sakura's work in the hospital, and the breath of the plague in the air, she shouldn't have to needlessly worry every morning that her daughter had died in the night. "Sorry, Mom," Sakura said, stretching out as she stepped out of bed and yawned. "I'll get dressed now. How are you feeling today?" "Fine," she replied quickly, and then realized that her mom was still waiting in the doorway, and so added, "No coughs or throat tickles, and I can feel all my fingers and toes." She watched Sakura tie up her hair for the day and sighed. "I'm being silly, aren't I? Nobody just kneels over from the plague. I need to stop worrying and remembering the stages." You would have thought that the mom of a medic ninja could at least do that. As her mother earnestly chastised herself, Sakura smiled. "There's a poster on the fridge door to help you." "I'm well aware of that, young lady," her mother said primly. But at last she turned away. "I'll do your breakfast. It's the least I can do." There was once a time when people thought plagues and diseases and poxes were caused by malevolent demons and lurking spirits, unleashed by unwitting sins or the displeasure of the gods. There was the time when they said diseases were foul mists, deadly misama that oozed from the ground in the pores of the infected. As Sakura traveled through the streets of Konoha, she felt that she could understand those beliefs. There was a tension in the heavy streets like a breath unbreathed, a living anticipation that was coiled and dangerous. The silence of birds when a wolf was crouched in the ferns. It was a settled and heavy unease, unmovable as a fog. She saw figures dressed head to toe in cloaks and the council-issued visors. They were the ninjas, the Genin in yellow, the Chunin in blue, the Jonin in red, and the medic ninja in black. Only their eyes were visible, and those eyes were usually cast down to the ground as they went about their missions. Little was spoken in the early morning apart from the formal greetings. The non-ninja civilians were just beginning to open their shops. As she ran past the local convenience, the owner was rolling up the shutters. He was an old, scowling man who smelt faintly of tobacco and mackerel. "Morning, Mr. Taranaka," Sakura called out. Taranaka turned around and lifted his graying eyebrows. "I didn't recognize you in your medic gear. You doctors look like witches in all your blacks. Any chance you could magic some ninjas back to life?" She laughed, despite the bitter note to his joke. "How are things?" "Less customers, so less business," Taranaka said, looking grim. He rolled up his sleeves and finished pushing the shutter above the door. "You run along now. Go do your job and save some ninjas. That'll save me and my old shop." There were shops closed all along the street. Many of the civilians with ninjas in their families had fled the town before Konoha had been quarantined, and now the glass windows of their shops were pasted over with newspapers. More fooled them, thought Sakura a little bitterly, because they had taken the plague with them and died anyway. Nobody was leaving Konoha anymore. Either the gates of the other towns were closed to them, or the plague was already there. Besides, when picking between a village with only the local healer in Konoha, with the most advanced knowledge of ninja medicine in the Land of Fire, Sakura thought it was obvious which the better option was. The receptionist was already at the hospital desk, shuffling feebly through papers. She looked up when Sakura signed in. By the looks of it, she had been at the desk all night. "The meeting's in the Mochizuki room, 4th floor," the receptionist told her flatly before going back to her papers. She was taking off the addresses of patients, the ones who had died in the night. Someone would have to go round from the hospital later on the face of it, offer condolences, but in actuality check for signs of infection in the rest of the family. Sakura hoped she wasn't doing rounds today. As she climbed the stairs to the 4th floor, there was a sound of running footsteps. Shizune appeared at the top of the stairs looking as pink as in the face as Tauntaun. "Oh, Sakura," Shizune called. "Thank goodness. I was about to send a messenger to your house. Come on, hurry. Nearly everybody else is here." Who's missing, Shizune? He's not missing. Kakashi's just late, as usual, Shizune muttered. Now come on, Tsunade's on her third cup of coffee already. It was nearly a week after the first 3 cases of the plague. Tsunade had announced a formal meeting to bring together the results of their research and decide on new measures. Shizune pushed open the door to the Mochizuki room. Found her on the stairs, Shizune announced, as Sakura followed her in, thinking that the circle of medical ninjas sitting around the table in their black visors and hoods looked like oversized crows crouched about a body. What kept you? Never mind. We'll have to save cards for another time. Tsunade's voice came from the largest figure in black at the end of the table. She packed away the cards she had been shuffling in her gloved hands and motioned for Sakura to sit at the empty space to her left. Shizune took the empty seat to her right. There were several Jonin and right cloaks at the table too. One was petting a large gray dog, another sat with his arms crossed. Sakura could see the edge of a scar near his eye through the slit of his visor. It was probably Shikamaru's dad. There was one empty seat at the table waiting for Kakashi-sensei. A gloved hand touched her wrist. Sakura looked up to find Ino sitting next to her, pens and paper ready to take notes. He'll be here soon, Ino said. Don't worry. Now that Sakura is here, let us begin, Tsunade said, and she clasped her hands in front of her. The first item on the agenda is our research on disease prognosis. Shizune, would you please stand? Yes, ma'am, Shizune said, as she stood from the table with a stack of notes. From a study of approximately 3,000 patients in collaboration with the head physicians of Ageha and Tateha, she nodded then to 2 figures in black at the end of the table. We have made the following observations. The disease acts over a course of 10 to 14 days, the majority dying around day 13. After initial infection, there is an asymptomatic latent period of 3 days, in which the patient is non-infectious. This stage is followed by 5 days, in which the patient is highly infectious, and experiences chronic coughing and a reported dulling of the senses. As the disease progresses, white sputum is observed. The patient may experience a generalized pain in his limbs, and lose sensation in the extremities of his body in the final stage of the disease. Rasmussen's aneurysm tends to be a major cause for hemoptysis. There was a sheepish knock and Kakashi entered the room. Sorry, I fell in a plague pit. Tsunade tutted impatiently and gestured for him to take a seat. Sakura felt the tension in the air finally ease away and uncapped her pen to take notes. Hemoptysis, continued Shizune, and this is followed by rapid multiple organ failure and death throughout the course of the disease. Physicians have noted fevers, chills, night sweats, and weight loss. She sat down and took a deep breath. Public speaking wasn't one of Shizune's strengths, and she was sweating under her cloak. The identity of the pathogenic organism itself I shall discuss with the aid of my 2 apprentices, Tsunade said, looking around the table, and then nodding at Ino and Sakura. We found that the cell walls did not take up a Gram stain, but appeared red under a microscope with the Gilles Nielsen. Looking at the lipid-rich cell walls and the similarities in its pathology, we have identified the pathogen as a hypervirulent strain of Microbacterium. One of the medic ninjas raised a hand. Tsunade nodded at her to speak. Have we found out why it's only infecting ninjas and not the civilians? Tsunade looked to Ino, who cleared her throat and spoke. On testing the Konoha civilians, we actually discovered that a lot of the civilians are infected, but the disease has not progressed to its infectious stage. The bacteria doesn't multiply in their bodies, because the bacteria only multiply in response to a very particular environmental stimulus. Ino shivered and gripped her notes. The bacteria multiply in the body with chakra use, and they multiply faster the stronger the chakra of the infected ninja. There was a muttering from the ninja around the table and frantic scribbling of notes. A medic ninja stood and shouted out. This would explain why the Chunin and the Jonin are the most affected groups, as opposed to the young children and the elderly. That is correct, Tsunade said with a nod as an appreciative mutter arose again. She then tapped the sheet of paper under Sakura's nose with her pencil and raised an eyebrow. This was Sakura's cue to stand and speak. My apprentice will now take us through the proposed origin of the disease. As all eyes turned on her expectantly, Kakashi's eyes glittering, Sakura breathed in and turned to her notes. After Hijiki Kobo had died, his notes from Orochimaru's laboratory had been sterilized and passed to her, and a team of medic Chunins, along with a case of cloudy vials found in Nemoto Ninjin's office. She had been up all night summarizing the results. Laboratory 29, Sakura began, swallowing nervously, was the laboratory in which Orochimaru was overseeing the care of a single patient, Kimimaru of the Kaguya clan. At some point during his errands for Orochimaru, Kimimaru was infected with a rare kind of chakra bacterium. From the laboratory reports, It was a disease with a very slow effect, a chronic disease, but the effects were the same as what we are experiencing now. The disease affected Kimimaro, not Orochimaru, nor Kabuto because of the quality of Kimimaro's bloodline limits, a unique limit that enabled control of his bones. Kimimaro's chakra system was constantly adjusting and readjusting as he transformed his body. It was in these stages of symptom adjustment that the old strain of the disease multiplied. "I'm not entirely sure I understand," began a red-cloaked Jonin. "It means that the chakra use is accompanied with some kind of physical transformation," Kakashi whispered to him, his half-eye lidded as he listened. Sakura noted that the pen and paper in front of him remained untouched. Orochimaru valued Kimimaro highly and set Kabuto to find a cure for the disease. In the meantime, Sakura turned over the page of her notes. In the meantime, Orochimaru took the microbacteria strain from Kimimaro and developed a range of hypervirulent strains with a deadly potential for use in bio-warfare. Nemoto Ninja infected herself with the first generation of the hypervirulent strains. The other 9 in the case were even more virulent and deadly than the disease we are dealing with now. "Question," said Nara, raising his hand amidst the angry and scared buzz of voices. Tsunade gave him permission and he lowered his hand. "Do the elders know that Konoha has a powerful set of bioweapons in his possession?" "They will know after this meeting." Tsunade's eyes gleamed. "That I burnt the case myself to stop it falling into the wrong hands." "Continue, Sakura." Shikaku Nara relaxed his grip on his armrests and seemed relieved. Sakura took up her notes again. "The only known patient of the old strain being Kimimaro, we propose that the old strain be henceforth known as Microbacterium Kimimarosis, and the strain we are dealing with now as Rapid Action Microbacterium Kimimarosis. In short, RAMK. She sat down as the medic ninja talked around her. Kakashi gave her a thumbs up. Sakura smiled, but then couldn't help but wonder what Kakashi and the Inuzuka woman beside him were doing there. Shikaku Nara was there to give advice on devising a strategy to combat disease spread. There was a Jonin with milk-bottomed thick glasses from the treasury, and a Chunin in blue from the Konoha Publications Office. The publications officer was recording the meeting in a scroll seal, and was responsible for making the pamphlets and editing the Konoha Times. There were lines around his eyes and bags of fatigue. His forehead was greasy. The previous officer had died 2 days ago, and the thought no doubt weighed on his mind. "The Kazekage has said he will gift us medical glassware and fine filtering masks, but apart from that notice, we have heard nothing from the other nations," Tsunade informed the ninjas in a crisp, brisk undertone. The Raikage and Tsuchikage, however, have recently put out orders to kill foreign ninjas and burn their bodies on sight. We shall see what the Mizukage has to say soon. Unfortunately, it will only be a matter of time before RAMK reaches them. There were dark murmurs of agreement and knowing smiles. Kakashi raised an eyebrow and Sakura had a feeling that he very much disapproved of the gallows humor. The meeting moved to discuss the Konoha economy and the lack of clients coming to Konoha to employ their ninjas. It seemed to be of some concern to the treasurer, who kept on pushing the glasses up the bridge of his nose, and sweating and stammering. But Tsunade, Sakura knew, was only half listening. Shizune knew that too and had pulled out a seal scroll to record what the man was saying. The hands of the clock slid around and touched 8. When they finished talking about the state of Konoha's affairs, Tsunade spoke up again. "To stop the spread, our best course of action is to take advantage of the 3-day latent period before the patient becomes contagious. Kakashi Hatake, you had a proposal for this?" Kakashi started and blinked. "I did?" "This is no time for games, Kakashi," snapped a medic ninja. "Forgive me, Okage," Kakashi said with a mild smile. He clapped his fist in his palm and raised a finger. "Yes, now I remember." "Watch where you're going," a man hollered, picking up the end of the stretcher he had just dropped. Through the visor of his black robes, the man's eyes glinted icy and sharp. "Sorry," Naruto shrank back to let the man pass by into one of the many ranks of tents set up outside the hospital, and then looked around the hospital grounds in bewilderment. What the hell's been happening here? He had been in the Myoboku Mountains when the news reached him about the plague, and as soon as he heard, he made the preparations to come back. Naruto couldn't stand the thought of being away, safe and sound and oblivious, when all the people he knew were fighting for their lives back home in Konoha, where his friends lived. They had let him in at the gates, although the ninjas had tried very subtly to urge him away. Nobody had said anything about stopping idiots trying to get into a plague-ridden city, only those trying to get out. Not that there were many of those anymore. The first thing that had taken getting used to were those accursed robes the ninjas were always wearing. as though they were afraid of the very air around them, which they were. He could see it in the lines around their eyes and the heavy purpose of their movements, like they didn't know when they were seeing the last loaf of bread in their hands or whether they were touching the doors of their houses for the final time, lighting their final candles. Naruto recognized Rock Lee first. Those thick eyebrows were a dead giveaway behind his visor. Bushy brow. Rock Lee glanced up and his eyes watered. Naruto, Naruto, my fellow comrade in the vigors of youth. Why have you come back? You'd think I could stay away? Naruto laughed. The laughter sounded a little hollow in the street, but he ignored the disapproving looks turned his way with the ease of habit. I heard about the plague. I'm here to help. Lee grasped his hand and shook it fervently. That's so noble of you, but I'm afraid that there's little you can do. There's little any of us can do if we're not medics. I'll do anything I can, Naruto said, looking down the street. 3 ninja were pulling a wagon loaded with long, lumpy objects, wrapped in sheets towards a thin column of smoke beyond. He swallowed, the Adam's apple bopping in his throat uncomfortably. I'll do anything. What are you doing? Lee pointed to the wicker basket strapped to his back, delivering rice. A lot of ninja families are shutting themselves up in their homes, the ones with children. The plague doesn't touch the children, but it gets their parents, and Konoha doesn't want any more orphans, if we can help it. Anyway, no clearer show of the power of youth. You want help with that? Naruto asked, as Lee strode on with his shoulders hunched under the basket, frowning with determination. I shall see my rice delivered if it be the last thing I do, Lee said stubbornly, but his eyes were smiling. Sakura and Ino are at the hospital. They'll be busy, but they'll be happy to see you back, and if you want to do something, the hospital will find you something to do. Thanks, bushy brow. Lee suddenly stopped and looked over his shoulder. As much as I admire your fashion sense, Naruto, you'll have to get a suit from the hospital to move around town. Nah, I'll be fine just as I am, said Naruto, putting his hand on his hips. I don't need no cloak and hooded mask to make me the handsomest ninja in Konoha, but you'll get infected, and with your high levels of chakra, Lee began to stammer, and Naruto was alarmed to see huge globs of tears welling in the corners of his eyes. Lee, chill. I'll be fine, trust me, Naruto stalled and scratched his face. How could he explain to Lee that the 9-tailed fox sealed in his belly protected him from chakra illnesses, making Naruto immune to the plague? As much as he hated to admit it, Jiraiya had been right. Jiraiya had advised Naruto from going back to Konoha. He said that it would be difficult for Naruto to explain his immunity, but Naruto had imagined that so long as Tsunade and the Jonins understood, he would be able to just get by just fine. Naruto settled for putting his hand on Lee's shoulder and looking him in the eye. Because I'm too stupid to be killed off by some bug, right? Right, agreed Lee, and wept fervent tears. Because you are a truly moronic ninja, Naruto. I salute you in your gutsy stubbornness. After bidding Naruto goodbye, Lee strode away down the road, still happily weeping. Naruto stared after him until he turned around the corner of the road, before making his way to the hospital. It took him half an hour to find Sakura amongst the tents pitched outside, or rather, she found him. The wards in the hospital were overflowing. There was no more room inside for patients, so they had to set up these emergency wards in the open air, all around them. The medic ninjas looked the same, filtering around in their black canvas robes and visors, and just looking at them made Naruto's skin crawl. The suit from the ninjas were practical, but they made the doctors look like shadow figures from nightmares. You're looking a little lost, said a dry voice behind him, when Naruto had finished glancing into a tent full of gaunt and pale men, lying still, very still, on low reed bedpans, feeling sick to the stomach. He whirled around and grinned shakily. Sakura! Naruto, you idiot. Why didn't you stay up on the mountain? No, don't even bother answering. Sakura sighed and slapped her forehead with her palm. Anyway, you're here now. Better make yourself useful. We can't have you lounging around dreaming about ramen when you've got 1,000 times the energy of the rest of us. We'll have to find you a suit. She trailed off and looked at him critically. I don't think we have any forgetting in your size. Don't worry, I won't need one, Naruto told her jovially. They're optional, right? That's only because we didn't think anybody would actually be stupid enough to opt out, but somehow, I reckon you'll be alright. Things have a silly way of working out for you, don't they? Sakura began to walk towards the main hospital building. Naruto frowned, still marveling at the sights of the strange robed figures carrying stretchers, holding clipboards, shouldering packs and baskets and bedding, drifting all around them like colored ghosts. It didn't look like Konoha anymore. This version of Konoha was an alien country to him. What do you think of it? Sakura asked, as she caught sight of him staring. Do you think this is hell? It isn't hell, Naruto said firmly, clenching his fists. It's still got our people in it. It's still got all our friends in it. And it's got Konoha ninjas helping other Konoha ninjas like only Konoha ninjas know how. It's a battlefield, Sakura. But not hell. It suddenly struck Naruto that he didn't actually know if Konoha still had their friends in it. He had met Lee and now Sakura. Lee had talked about Ino, but he knew nothing about what happened to the others. What about Shikamaru and Shoji? Neji, Tenten, and Hinata? What about the Jonins? How were all of them holding up? The moment when he didn't even ask Sakura if their friends were dead or alive, Naruto finally realized what the feeling clawing its way up his throat since he stepped through the Konoha gates had been. It was dread. The dread of standing at the edge of an ocean and seeing the rolling crest of a very dark wave coming to the shore. Strangely enough, they could hear the sound of barking dogs coming out of Tsunade's office. Sakura knocked on the door and they stood in the corridor, waiting to be let in. Naruto thought of Kakashi Sensei and his pack of ninja dogs. He thought of his friends. And then his thoughts turned to the men at the gates who had laughed when he had entered the village, and told him he wouldn't be able to get out again. At least, Naruto told himself, I have a village, even if a sick one, because in the village we all look out for each other. His thoughts turned to the ninjas who were villageless, and on the run in the forest of the Land of Fire, being hunted as rogues or criminals. I wonder where he is, Naruto murmured, as a medic ninja ran past him with a fistful of painkillers. Sakura looked up at the ceiling, and the barking from Tsunade's office seemed to get louder. Sasuke? Who knows? But the other nations are killing all strange ninja on sight now. He won't be able to go very far. It was night on the road and the mosquitoes were already whining. 3 figures in long coats were waiting in a hawthorn thicket, killing their breaths. There was a rustle in the grass and another figure joined them. Finally, she's here, one said, pushing himself up with the help of a giant sword. How long does it take to buy some grains? Shut it, Suigetsu, the last figure snapped. It was hard enough getting past the guards. The town was much better guarded than usual and I could hardly find a shop open to steal from. I'd like to have seen you do better. Enough, said another, rising to his feet. Let's move. One moment. The figure who had been in the town coughed into her fist, cleared her throat, and then coughed some more. Are you alright? Asked the largest figure in the group. It's just a cold, she replied. Sasuke, please don't worry on my account. Sasuke isn't worrying about you, muttered the figure with the sword. That was Jugo. Are you deaf as well as blind in the dark, Karin? Enough, said the figure already, quickly moving along the road. Let's move on. The 4 figures melted into the darkness as shadows.